Hello, welcome to today's lecture for Race and Ethnicity, where we are going to discuss the origins of American slavery and that connection to the invention of our modern concept of race that we still see prevalent in our society today. So I want to start by reminding us of the information that we learned last week, which is that race is a social creation. There's nothing biological about race as we use it in our society today or has been used for the last several hundred years. But it is, again, reminding you of one of your vocab words. It's a symbolic category that we misrecognize as natural. So we categorize people based on this idea of race, and then we recognize it as natural, or rather misrecognize it as natural, when in reality there is nothing natural about it. Race is also a historical product. So when we're talking about race and ethnicity, we're looking at it from a sociological perspective, but also from a historical perspective. And when we talk about our ideas of race, it's a relatively new concept. It's a relatively new creation. And if we looked, back in human history about 600 years ago, which I know might seem like a long time ago, but in the big scheme of human history, 600 years is not that long. And we had a world without race. Yes, people were still grouped together and classified in ways, but it was not according to race as we understand it today. And so throughout this lecture, we'll discover what it is about, the events that took place a few hundred, 600 years ago that brought about this new idea of race. And so, there's new things like, of course, in that time period, a new world would be discovered. And I use quotations there because obviously it was already discovered for the millions of indigenous inhabitants, but Europeans, would discover a new world. And at the same time, we also have a new economic system, especially that of capitalism, or specifically that of capitalism. We have new political arrangements, so nations are starting to develop. We'll also have, especially by the 19th century, really strong use of science and rationality among humans. And so all of these are going to contribute to race emerging as a new way of viewing and ordering societies and the world. So more than any other European country, Spain and England are responsible for basically bringing about not just slavery, but this new concept of race as we continue to know it today. And so we have to ask ourselves, where in these two regions' history do we get, this idea of especially classifying people or viewing people a certain way? And so we'll discuss each of them individually, but I want to start with England, because even though Spain will colonize first, England has a little bit more long-standing ways that will eventually contribute to the development of race-based slavery in the colonies. And also England, it will be the British colonies that will eventually become the United States of America. Not to say there aren't parts of what was the Spanish Empire that would as well, but it's primarily these English colonies. And so when we're looking at England, we need to understand that England, like much of Northern Europe, was really isolated from the world and for many centuries. And so they really had very limited knowledge of what lie outside their region of Northern Europe, and also just really minimal contact with people outside of this region. But there is one area within Northern Europe that England had coveted for centuries, and that was Ireland. And since the 12th century, England had been invading Ireland over and over. And one of the reasons was, well, in large part, was the fertile region of Ireland, the ability to grow particular crops, wheat especially, that existed in Ireland that did not exist in all parts of England. And so the English, as I said, covet this area, but they start using descriptions about the Irish that we will see mimicked later on when the English would encounter indigenous peoples in North America. And so, for many centuries, you would hear about or see written about the Irish as being rude, beastly, ignorant, cruel, unruly infidels. And then savages was another word that was used to describe the Irish. And this was not just in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, but this would continue well into the 20th century, where, as we'll discuss later on with immigration, events would change where the Irish would become a bit more of an accepted part of the United States. But for a good couple centuries of the colonial and early republic period, and even in, like I said, into the 20th century, the Irish were considered sort of the undesired European peoples, and England, you know, could use these justifications as a reason for going in and invading Ireland. So this mindset that the Irish needed correcting somehow, like they were not, their society was not appropriate and the English needed to come in and correct them, would dictate, as I said, how the English would view America's indigenous peoples. And so we have this history of the English people already sort of identifying those they view as, you know, different than them, though certainly this is not race-based, because if we looked at an Englishman and an Irishman, there'd be many features when we look at a person and their phenotype that would be very similar. And so this, again, was not about racial classification, but in this case, one could even argue this is more about class or social status. But I think it's also interesting that in both the case of the Irish and the lands of the indigenous people, what the English desired most was land in both of these cases. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what does the desire for land, which the land can then generate into profit, what does that, right, have to do with this creation of race, especially by the 17th century? So that's a little bit of background on the English and the mindset they will bring to the New World. But let's talk about Catholic Spain. And I very specifically use Catholic Spain here because so much of Spain's endeavors into the New World are very religious based. And this was a very Catholic country. And pretty much all of Europe was, if they were Christian, but they were Catholic Christian until the Protestant Reformation in 1517. And so Spain will maintain its Catholic religion even after that point. And even before 1498, when Columbus's voyages, kick off sort of the expeditions throughout what becomes known as the New World, even before that, this Catholic Spanish people had been involved in this classification of people by religion. And so there had been that, well, first of all, the Islamic empires had been spreading for centuries, and they had come into this area called the Iberian Peninsula. And these people, known as the Moors, they were Muslim, had been very accepting of people's religion and languages and traditions. And so we call this a pluralistic society. So for many centuries, this region of the Iberian Peninsula had been a pluralistic society. But when Ferdinand and Isabella came to power in Spain, they really wanted more of this, homogenous society, right? And they wanted everyone to be Catholic. And so basically, Jews and Muslims were given three choices. You either convert, you leave, or you die. And so the Spanish Inquisition, you either convert, you leave, or you die. And many people did choose to convert just so they could stay and also not be killed. But the question came among the Spanish, especially the Spanish royalty, have these people really altered their views, or are they, Jewish or Muslim, sort of in private, but publicly Catholic? And so the Spanish Inquisition will begin in 1478, where it will basically be a purge. And this time where the both the Catholic Church and the Spanish royalty, which are kind of one and the same at that point, go through society trying to basically wipe out those who are not pure religious, right, Catholic people. And so in fact, you start to have people carrying around with them certificates of ancestral purity based in religion, essentially. You also at this time have new identities based on national affiliation. So not only do you need to be Catholic, but there's this idea of who can be a member of Spain, right? Who can belong to Spanish society. And so, what these are basically is the early roots of nations. And they're imagined communities. Nations are created by humans, just as boundaries are, borders, race, gender, all of these social constructs that are created as a way to order society. And this is, we see many waves of it throughout history. Humans organize society, right? So that people can function together. So these imagined communities that would then be bound together by also artificially created political boundaries, right? So who gets to control politically one region or another? Again, that's all human made. But we start to see this really strong process of classifying people as a way of tying them together, right? And so Spain united these imagined communities through religious repression. So if you were not the right religion, you'd be repressed. And they would carry that over to the New World, where they would force indigenous peoples to convert to Catholicism. And so we see this process in Spain through religious repression, but eventually other nations will start to do this through racial repression. So we see both England and Spain, before they ever even come to the New World, having these mindsets and these sort of traditions as part of their society, where there is this process of classifying or justifying the right to take over one's lands or to oppress people based off these particular factors. And this will lay the foundation for racial repression that will arise in the colonial period. So the other thing I want to talk about real quick. So we've got this sort of some history of England, some history of Spain and their mindsets and trying to think, they didn't just arrive in the New World and decide to put these societies into effect. They're carrying over, right, existing mindsets and ways of doing things from the old world. But we also need to keep in mind that by the 15th century, the world and Europe, not the world, but specifically Europe, and then the world will, be impacted by this, has began what we now call the Age of Discovery or the Age of Exploration. In Europe, there had been changes in the economic system. So as we get rid of the medieval ways, the end of feudalism, and we start to have a growing merchant class, we start to have capitalism, which is going to increase demands for goods. We're going to start to see expeditions that take, and especially after 1492, when Columbus's discoveries sort of open up new places to colonize. We're going to see a change in the structure of society based off the economic needs of people who are controlling these colonies, essentially, or who are benefiting from these colonies. And what we just start to have with the rise of capitalism is no longer creating goods for need just because they're the items that people need, but producing goods for profit. And so whether that's in the form of cash crops like tobacco, rice, cotton, whether that's in the form of processed goods that we find that we will find with the rise of industrialization, what we're starting to see is, again, just this new mindset of profit over need. And also Europeans are sort of starting to unite themselves, even though they are still separate regions and at war with each other often. We're starting to see this idea of the West versus the rest. And so the West coming on the rise and feeling as if they have some sort of superior civilization, that they need to go out and correct the behavior and ways of other peoples, when realistically that is justification for the ability to go out and colonize and conquer lands of other people for the purpose of generating profit. And then I do have here, of course, so we have the Age of Discovery that begins in about 1415 with Portugal, and then that will eventually transition into Spain and England being the dominant leaders in imperialism in the New World. The French and Dutch are involved as well, but when we're talking about racial classification, the Spanish and English are certainly more relevant, which is why we will just focus on them today. But so we have this going on through the 15th century, but it'll be the Columbus voyage of 1492 that will change the course of history and also change the way humans start to classify themselves in this new world. So Columbus's voyages sparked a rush of expeditions to the Americas with the intention of colonizing these lands for profit, as I just said. And what we start to see is this wave of colonialism or imperialism. Colonialism occurs when a foreign power invades a territory and establishes enduring systems of exploitation and domination over that territory's indigenous peoples. And so basically what you had in this case, and that you have in many cases of colonialism, is military acts plus superior technologies, plus violence and deception equal an appropriation of the resources and the lands of conquered peoples. And so Europeans did have a stronger military. They had superior technologies, if not necessary. Superior civilization is a relative idea, but when we talk about technologies, unfortunately, their weaponry was more advanced than many of sort of the primitive tools that the indigenous people had been using and being very successful with. They'd never had any reason to advance their weaponry, but unfortunately, they cannot compete. And so Europeans are able to come in and, basically conquer. And so, specifically, the type of colonialism that happens in the Americas is called settler colonialism. And there's different types of colonialism, but settler colonialism is this, where you basically push off the already inhabiting people of the land, push them off, and you take over for your own economic profit. So the Spanish are the first to do this. They desired gold, silver, land, and of course those Catholic converts. They, by the 16th century, have conquered Tenochtitlan, which was the capital city of the Aztec Empire. Once they do this, and this was like the hub of the Spanish Empire, the Aztec Empire was very wealthy, it was very large. And so the gold and jewels and art and textiles and all of the things that the Spanish were able to take over, and eventually the Spanish crown will basically give the lands over to these conquistadores who were the ones responsible for conquering the Aztec Empire. The Spanish crown will eventually give these lands to these men. And what we start to see in Spanish society in the New World is a process of intermarriage. So we do have African people who have already been brought over to the Caribbean by this time. And so in the Aztec Empire, which is today basically this region here, and we have, I'm not getting it exactly right, it's a little hard with the laser. What we have is basically have African, Spanish, and indigenous peoples in these new societies. And so we do have, intermixing of these different groups of people through sexual relations that, result in children of mixed ancestry. But what we especially have is the purposeful marriage between Spanish men and indigenous women. And this was a strategy used by the Spanish crown to basically stabilize the region. And so if you can sort of bring under control the people by marrying into or having them marry into your family, then you can provide some stability. That does not mean by any means that there was no oppression towards indigenous people. And in fact, the oppression towards indigenous people in the Spanish Empire was very brutal and very exploitative. The indigenous people were being used as a form within, and this is another thing we need to, and maybe I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but when we talk about the origins of American slavery, slavery is an institution that has existed since the beginning of civilization. So there's been many different
waves of slavery, many different types of slavery. There is still slavery today. Human trafficking is a form of slavery, and there are other types of slavery that, or other types of labor that some people could argue are slavery. For example, agricultural work, the prison system. So these are just other, debated but possible types of slavery that exist today. Definitely human trafficking, though. So when we talk about the indigenous people being used as a slave labor force, right? We need to understand that's because, the type of slavery that as Americans we have become so familiar with, as that's been a part of our history, was just one type of slavery. And so the oppression of indigenous people was horrific. And there was one Spanish bishop, Bartolome de las Casas, who, basically started talking about this and made sure that the Pope and other leaders within the Catholic Church were aware of this. And so in 1542 the Catholic Church puts out basically what were called the new laws. And so it was a number of laws, but one of the things this did was it outlawed indigenous slavery. So it said that the settlers of this region, of these colonies, of the growing Spanish Empire, had to treat the indigenous people better than an exploitative labor force, basically. But it said nothing about African slavery, which does exist in the Spanish Empire at this time. And in fact, this reduction of indigenous slave labor actually will lead to the increase in African slavery, because they're still, they've got silver mines and minimal agriculture, but still agricultural needs. Mostly it's mining, the slave labor is needed for. And so there still is a labor force required and desired. And so we will see African slavery actually increase after this. But keep in mind, this still does not have anything necessarily to do with the color of one's skin. And we'll talk about in a little bit why African people were basically would eventually be chosen, if you will, as the desired labor force. Now let's talk about English conquest. The English were not looking for converts. They were not looking to intermarry and become sort of one cohesive society, even if there was oppression and discrimination. The English desired land. Now, obviously, you do have the situation of the settlers in the northern parts, the northern colonies, that were religious colonies. And so they were looking for safety from religious persecution that had taken place back in Europe. So you do have those religious colonies, but when we're talking about the bulk of English settlers, we're talking about those southern colonies. We're talking about Jamestown, Virginia, which was the first English colony in 1607. These are agricultural colonies, and so the desire for land is first and foremost. In fact, the English would put forth statutes that prohibited intermarriage with indigenous people. So they're very much structuring their society to have separate, separateness, if you will. The English will also be the first to create a term that had not existed ever in that part of the world, at least, and that is the term of Indian. Now, keep in mind that we kind of take that term for granted today, and in fact, it's probably not even the preferred term, but there was no concept of the Indian the way that the English and later Americans would come to use it, because all indigenous people considered themselves part of their tribe. They did not consider themselves sort of a cohesive one group of people, right? There are many differences religiously, rituals, the languages, all of these different factors. But what happens is the English will lump them all together under this single classification of Indian. So we call that homogenization. So the English will have this process of homogenization and then polarization. And the polarization is this creation of not just Indians, but good and bad Indians. And so you have the noble savage who is childlike yet pure, primitive yet one with nature. And then you have the ignoble savage who is wicked and fearsome. So you're polarizing this large group of people that you've just clumped together under one heading. You're polarizing them, right? And so who's going to be the good Indians? The good Indians will be the people that are willing to work with the English, right? The bad Indians will be the ones who are, going to be hostile and resist having their lands taken over. And so those will be the ones where then you can justify having wars with them, right? Taking over their lands even in a more violent way than you may have. And so this process of homogenization and polarization is really starting to not only divide society up, but it's starting to take people who are lumped in this sort of one group and having them even, and that's not to say indigenous people weren't at war before, they certainly were, and all of their various elements of society, right? Many of them included being a warring people, not all but many. And so not to say you didn't have conflict within among indigenous tribes before, but you just start to have this, everybody's been lumped together at one, but now you're sort of being defined by this good or bad, really simplistic way of defining groups of people. And that's going to cause conflict as well. As the English began to thrive in North America, we also will simultaneously see indigenous people die off at alarming rates. In fact, it's considered the greatest human catastrophe, even more than the bubonic plague. It's like 90%. And in many cases, entire tribes would become extinct. And this is in large part due to disease, but also warfare was an element of this loss of life as well. This also will have a huge impact on the rise of African slavery. So we see both in the Spanish and the British Empire events taking place that will eventually result in African laborers being the desired choice for basically the plantation system that will come about in the American South. So this is where I really want to now start to talk about the invention of whiteness and blackness. So obviously, we've looked at some historical factors. We've looked at the process by which both the Spanish and English are starting to set up society to have a desired labor force. And so let's just break this down just a little bit more so we can understand how we actually, but we still don't have, by this time, we don't have a concept of whiteness or blackness yet. Because again, African laborers weren't being chosen or imported in greater numbers because of their skin color. It was because they were a readily available labor source. The blackness part of that will be created. So let's see how that happens. So by the 1620s, as I just said a moment ago, a plantation system was basically organized around agricultural production for profit, was very reliant on a coerced labor force that had been set up. So you have this growing plantation system by the 1620s, right? Agricultural production for profit. And you must, in order to make a profit, you must have a labor source. But that labor source, more often than not, has to be coerced, right? Nobody wants to just go out and grow tobacco for the fun of it. And if you can pay your workers little to nothing, then your profits will be increased as well. Now, the English do find themselves in a position of needing to purposely find an exploitable people to extract these riches of the New World. Um, and again, we need to keep in mind that African laborers were not the first go-to for this. So let's follow this little process as this happens. First and foremost, it was the indigenous. But as we saw, indigenous people died off in large numbers, that there weren't enough of them to provide this strong labor force that was needed. And not only that, but indigenous people could escape much easier. They knew the terrain much better than the English people did. And so they could escape. So they were not a reliable labor source. Then we have a period where indentured servants are being used. This indentured, so if you don't know what indentured servants are, essentially it's a contract period. So typically 5 to 7 years you would labor for this person who owned the plantation, and then at the end of that time you yourself would receive a little plot of land. Eventually this would turn into a system of slavery as well. Oftentimes there would be policies and situations established where people could not get out of their contract. The contracts would be extended. And then as more people started to make it through, and initially this wasn't a problem because people were dying off so quickly once they got to the New World. But as people started to build up their immunity and live their contract out, and they actually wanted that plot of land, they became problematic for the owners, the landowners that were already there. And so we'll start to see indentured servitude actually transition into a form of slavery as well. Just to give you an idea of who the English were using as indentured servants, oftentimes it was English people who barter their passage from England to the colonies, and to pay that off, they'll agree to work for a period of time. Sometimes it was impoverished English men and women, and children who were actually kidnapped off the streets of London and put on ships to be brought over to America. So very much the roots of a system of slavery there. Native Americans who would be stolen from tribal homelands. So obviously that would happen in larger numbers until we start to see a decrease in Native Americans. Of course, Africans brought to Americas by the slave trade. In 1619, the first Africans will arrive in Virginia. We don't know. We have very strong evidence that they were brought on as an indentured labor force, not a slave labor force, and that in those early colonial periods, there often wasn't a lot of distinction, at least, skin color wise, about who was indentured and who was enslaved, that was not a factor in that particular status for a person. And so those original African people that are brought to the New World, that doesn't mean there isn't a slave trade going on, but were they being brought over to work as indentured servants? Because we know there were African landowners in the colonial period, some of whom had worked off their contract and gotten the land that was promised, and some of whom then would go on to be slave owners themselves. And so that's complicated. So we still, even though we see African people being brought to the Americas as part of the slave trade, we still can't definitively say that they were all enslaved because of the color of their skin. And then we also have the quote unquote savage Irish that are being conquered in war back in Ireland and sold in the Irish slave trade. So there was a thriving Irish slave trade that was going on at that time as well. And many of those people would be brought to the Americas. So all of these groups of people were participating, or were, working as indentured servants. But eventually, we will see this system of Black slavery come about, where it is specifically enslavement for people of African ancestry. So I want to cover one more thing before we move on. Actually, let me make sure. Yeah, no, we'll get to that in a minute. So while we have, this colonial period beginning in, really kind of the 1620s, throughout the 17th century, and we have the growth of the plantation system, we have more of a need for this exploitable labor force. We are going to see throughout the 17th century, and there's a handout that you will read as part of this week's coursework that will show you a number of different laws and policies that come into effect that really start to distinguish people based off their skin color. But we need to really remember that prior to the 1620s, that was not the norm, and that for the first few decades of the colonial period, there was a lot of fluidity in who was a servant and who was a slave, and it had nothing really to do with skin color. But we do start to see that develop throughout the 17th century in these laws and policies. And then in 1676, we have an event take place that will really start to be, I argue, the moment where we start to see the sort of black versus white when we're talking about a labor force. And that was Bacon's Rebellion. So Bacon's Rebellion, essentially, for time's sake, we'll be quick here, was a rebellion of African, English, and Irish workers in Jamestown, Virginia, who had all been working side by side as this exploited labor force. And they rose up against these wealthy plantation owners, as well as against the colonial government that supported the worker exploitation. You had white workers fighting side by side with black workers because they all saw themselves as slaves. They were the working class. They were the exploited class. They didn't see themselves as black worker, white worker. They saw themselves as this class of people who was being exploited by the upper class and the colonial government. Um, and this rebellion was put down. People were punished. And what starts to happen in this moment is that the landowners and the colonial authorities realize something needs to happen, because this rebellion, if it had been successful, could have threatened the security of the colonial system, of the economy and the government. So there's some sort of distinction that needs to be made so you don't have these working class rebellions anymore. And this is where we will start to see basically the carrot, the dangling of the carrot of whiteness put in front of poor white people. And basically, what landowners and the colonial government and later the American government will dangle in front of poor white people is this: yes, you might be poor, and yes, you may never be able to, right, be a landowner, but at least you can't be a slave. Because what we start to see happen by the end of the 17th century is this very clear idea that slavery, specifically this form of chattel slavery, which is outright ownership of another human being, which is similar to owning land, goods, etc., for the duration of their life and that of their children, this chattel slavery would start to be a marker that was placed upon people of African descent. And after Bacon's Rebellion, we will really start to see this racial classification take strong hold and become embedded basically in this American system. And so while we see the process, sort of the foundation of it being laid throughout the 17th century, Bacon's Rebellion was sort of the moment where the upper class and the political elite realize they cannot have these working class rebellions. They have got to keep these people separate. And the way you do that is by dangling freedom in front of one. Even if the poor people will never be able to own land, at least then they have this mindset that they cannot be enslaved. So as white people, even the poorest white people, will gain more freedom, people of African descent will descend into this permanent state of slavery. Okay, but why? There's still the question of why. Why do the colonial authorities, the landowners, didn't need to distinguish by race. They chose to distinguish by race. They could have chose to distinguish from some other classification. But what people had realized by the 17th century is that people of African descent had basically become this quote unquote perfect slave. Why? Well, unlike the Irish, who the English despised the Irish, they hated the Irish, right? They thought they were the lowest class of people that existed on the earth, right? They didn't necessarily think that about African people, but they definitely thought that about the Irish people. The problem is an escaped Irish slave could blend in to English society, right? So we start to see this determining who is a slave and who is not by one's skin color, right? That's where the blackness comes in. But then we have some other reasons that have nothing to do with one's skin color. African slaves were not familiar with the American landscape the way that indigenous people were. African slaves were immune to old world disease because they had been in contact with, right, people of the old world through the trading networks that had existed for centuries. So they wouldn't die off in large numbers the way the indigenous people, and they were used to the tropical climate of the American South, which was very similar to Western Africa. Also, many Africans had been farmers back in Africa, in West Africa, so they knew how to farm. The Irish were pastoralists. They were really good at raising sheep and other herding animals like that, but they weren't good farmers. And so what you start to have is a number of different reasons, only one, which really has to do with one's skin color, why African people become this, as I said, quote unquote, perfect slave. And so what we start to have is this system of black slavery. which is a different form of slavery than had ever existed up to this point. It will become incorporated into American society as a formalized establishment through a series of social and legal changes that took place between 1660 and 1860. So, for a couple hundred centuries, Black slavery will be not only ingrained, but will be kept a part of American society, so that these landowners and the government, right, have this reliable labor source to generate profits for the colonies and then later the American government. And so we will talk about the period before the Civil War, and then we'll talk about the Jim Crow era after the Civil War in a future lecture. But we really need to understand that initially there was not some, target to when we talk about the period before the Civil War, we'll get more into how African people even became a part of the slave trade. We'll get more into that history, and then we'll look at slavery in America more specifically. But for the sake of this lecture, I really just want you to understand that there was no, like sort of like purposeful attempt, initially at least, to go into Africa and kidnap people simply because of the color of their skin to make them a labor force. That there were other avenues that had been taken. There were existing mindsets that the English and the Spanish brought over with them to the New World that helped this process along, but it was not some sort of like, foreseen circumstance that was going to, make people of African descent the preferred slave labor force, but by these various factors, that is what came to be. So by the 17th century, or excuse me, by the end of the 17th century, you basically have twins birthed from the same womb. Blackness and whiteness entered the world as new creations whose very essences were defined by and through each other. You could not have one without the other. Whiteness only existed because of blackness, and blackness only existed because of whiteness. And now that they've been created, we start to give each of them power or lack of power. They only exist with each other. What's interesting is the white race was created by lumping together people of different classes. In English society, those lower class whites and upper class whites would typically have never had anything in common. That's what's so remarkable about this, is that the elites in the English colonial system are willing to reclassify their society not based in class, but in race. And that is so that they can hold on to their power. And so you have these different classes of people being lumped together as the white race, who really have nothing else besides that in common. You also will have African people who before were, belong to hundreds of different tribes and ethnic groups who are also at once brought into one single racial category. Groups of people who maybe didn't even like each other back. They were warring tribes, right? They don't have the same language or the same ethnicity or customs or anything with fellow African people, that they're now being lumped together as part of the Black race. So English America brought about a new era, not one that separated Christian from heathen or gentleman from barbarian. Another way of saying that is upper class from lower class, but a world separating people of different races. So it's very important that we understand this foundation of the invention of race in our American society if we're going to then understand how this impacts other groups of people that will, have to either earn their way into being part of the quote unquote white race, or who will be excluded, and how treatment of the quote unquote Black race, right, lays the foundation for how all other groups of people who eventually come into America, or in the case of Indigenous people are already here, are treated by this created white race. And so that's what we'll basically spend the rest of the semester analyzing, is this, these different levels, so that when we say, by the time we get to the end of the semester, if anyone says to you, well, yeah, slavery died, or slavery's over, and it's been over, like, why are we still talking about this? Because we can then see that it wasn't just about being enslaved. It's a mindset and a system that developed that we've never fully gotten rid of. And so we have to understand that system if we even want to have a chance of tearing down the system to create something, more egalitarian that is not based in one skin color. Okay, I will talk to you in the next lecture.